This video is sponsored by the Center for Writing and Speaking at Agnes Scott College. Welcome everyone to our second installment of the 2020 Essential Elements for Writing Workshop Series. My name is Kaitlyn, a senior tutor in the Center for Writing and Speaking at Agnes Scott College, and I will start us off by giving a brief introduction to how we craft analysis and some steps we can take to be effective analytical writers. Let's begin by defining analysis and talking about what makes it distinct from other key elements of academic writing. Analysis is the process of examining and interpreting a piece of text or summarized content to determine its deeper meaning and prove a point. I want to draw attention to the fact that analysis is a process, which means it takes time. When you are reading, you are actively searching for meaning. So, contrary to the popular belief, analysis is more than just refining a set of skills. It's a frame of mind, an approach that you take to both reading and writing. It's very easy to conflate analysis with summary and even our own arguments. Let's talk a little bit about what makes writing analysis different from each of these. Summary is defined as recapitulation, review, and/or retelling of relevant information, usually the main points, found in a text without the addition of original thoughts and ideas. Because you aren't adding any original ideas, summary requires very small interpretive leaps and no conclusions are made at this stage. Remember, analysis is about searching for meaning, and summaries help to provide a synopsis of a topic. Your argument is a thesis statement. Analysis of primary and secondary source material throughout your research helps to offer evidence, make claims to support your thesis statements. Analysis and argument largely differ in the kinds of questions you must answer. When preparing to write analysis, you will want to keep these questions in mind. What is my argument or my thesis? When you're writing, it is important to keep in mind what you are trying to argue so all of your sources are relevant and your analysis is focused. This also helps you streamline the type of detail you look for in your sources. You want your textual evidence to be supportive, but you also want to look for contradicting elements which should be addressed that may help strengthen your argument. How does the author of the source I am reading construct meaning? It is important to take into account the assumptions the author makes and why they make them. What kind of rhetorical devices does the author use to clearly convey their message, and how do they relate to the themes and main points of their writing? How can you apply this to your writing? Think about the bigger questions of how and why. Analysis should address how and/or why the themes, rhetorical devices, motifs, and events are important to the text and to your argument. If these two questions strengthen your thesis and support what you're trying to prove, then your analysis is headed in the right direction. What kinds of sources does the author use? Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. First, the sources an author cites can be useful to help you further construct your argument. They may offer another perspective that aligns or contradicts your own, and it can provide a broader variety of sources for you to draw from. Second, the sources an author cites can help you determine the author's stance and credibility. Do the sources an author cites use opposing claims or claims that lead to the same conclusion? Are the sources an author uses credible? Finally, what does this mean? Remember that analysis is all about searching for meaning. Many times we get caught up in solely trying to prove the point, but we have to think about that so what question. What does my argument mean in the context of the field within which I'm writing? Try to think on a global scale and make connections to other fields. This will make you more mindful about the topics we discuss in our classes at Agnes Scott and how they relate to our daily lives and help us determine how our learning or our research can help make a difference both within and beyond our sphere of influence. You will need to incorporate this idea in every paper you write, so indicate to readers why your argument matters to them and how it adds to their understandings of your field, your discipline, and your topic. Finally, I want to recommend 5 key actions for crafting successful analysis. First, aim to understand. When you begin reading and searching for meaning, delay judgment. Think beyond whether you agree or disagree, if you like or dislike the author's argument. Ask yourself how the reading adds, expands, or changes your knowledge about the subject material. I personally like to use the KWL approach when I read for my assignments. Before reading, I list out what I know about the subject, and then I write questions about what I want to know. After I read, I write down what I learned from the reading. This helps me to approach sources with a targeted focus and helps me aim to understand the material better. For more strategies to get you thinking about how to critically engage source material, check out our Writing Across Borders workshop video. Number 2, define significant parts and their relativity. Pay attention to key elements of an author's argument and how they choose to support that argument. At the CWS, we love to say, notice what you notice. When we read, we pick up on these key elements and even how they are related to one another. Keep those in mind as you begin searching for meaning or crafting analysis. Number 3, make the implicit explicit. Push your observations by asking that so what question. What are the implications not only of the argument, but also what is intentionally excluded from your or another source's writing? The pursuit of meaning will drive your thinking and writing forward towards concrete solutions. Number 4, repetition, contrast, and anomalies. In virtually all subjects, repetition is a sign that the author wants to emphasize a subject. Anomalies help you revisit your arguments and assumptions about source material. Is your or secondary author's argument consistent across all contexts? How does your argument add a new perspective to the current literature? Number 5, keep formulating questions and explanations. As I talked about earlier, analysis is a process that includes layers of questions and explanations. As you keep reading and as you keep learning, your questions and your explanations will change. Be open to that and enjoy the process of crafting analysis. Now that I've given you some general information about how to craft analysis, remember every discipline builds on this concept in different ways. In order to prepare you for crafting analysis in your major, we will talk more specifically about the following fields: STEM, social sciences, philosophy, and English. Feel free to watch them all, but you can navigate to these timestamps to get more information on how to craft analysis in your major. Thanks for joining us.
Hello friends, and welcome to the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, or STEM section of this workshop. My name is Arin Yost, and I'm going to talk about analysis in STEM, as well as just some general tips for writing in STEM. Usually, writing in STEM tends to fall into 3 broad categories: experiments, reviews, and research plans. In this section, we'll talk about some broad strokes that apply to all 3 and note some differences. First, what is considered the right number or type of sources? In both reviews and experiments, you will incorporate lots of sources. The purpose of these is to prove why your hypothesis is novel and important. You want to show that you know what other researchers are doing and how your work fits into that greater conversation. In research plans, your literature review section will not be as extensive because the paper itself is so much shorter, but you can and should be able to briefly explain the background of your hypothesis, which will include others' research. If you're not sure how to write a lit review, be sure to check out our upcoming workshop on everything you need to know about abstracts and literature reviews. These sources, however, are always going to consist of other experiments that other researchers in your field have conducted. Developing this understanding of the state of related research will help you explain the so what of your hypothesis. You want to be able to explain why your experiment is a critical addition to your field of study, whereas in a review or a research plan, this understanding will simply explain why your hypothesis is important, because you haven't actually conducted the experiment yet. So now you've explained what already exists. This is what you're building off of in the experiment that you're writing about. Here are some tips for breaking down the newer research you're introducing to your reader. You want to explain everything in the context of the hypothesis. Most of this comes in the results and discussion part of writing about an experiment. You'll take apart each section of your data to explain what's going on in the context of your hypothesis. Asking and answering questions like, what does this mean? Is this significant? Were you expecting this? What would you do next? Before you end with a call to action, which will explain what other research could do to build on your findings. Finally, here are some general tips for writing in STEM. You don't want to crowd your paper with jargon. Sometimes, of course, this is unavoidable, but you want to write as if you could explain everything in it to a 5-year-old. You don't want your language to be too flowery. This is analytical. You're building a narrative based on your evidence, and your opinion will really only be in your analysis of the data, but you should still be assertive about it. Use phrases like, this could be interpreted as, or this data suggests that, to explain your thoughts. Finally, don't get too attached to a style. Good writing and adaptability establishes you as a budding scientist. Thanks for listening in to the STEM portion of this workshop. Move forward to find out more about resources that can help you write here.
Hi, I'm Felicia Jacques and I'm a senior at Agnes Scott. This section will cover how analysis typically looks in social science disciplines. Specifically, I will identify ways you can analyze material in political science, international relations, also referred to as IR, sociology, history, and psychology. Each field is committed to the study of societies and the relationships among individuals within those societies. Some of the social sciences share universal ways for analysis, such as when looking for sources or inserting evidence in an assignment. For the most part, however, they each have their own prescribed method to observe society. The nuances in each discipline appear when looking for a source, deciding how to use a source, and finally, explaining how the source relates to your thesis. In political science, you want to try and find sources that were written in the past 10 years to help with relevancy. In psychology, you want to find sources that are more experimental, data-driven, and theoretical. In sociology, you want to search for sources that are similar to the kind in psychology, but you also want to look at databases or academic journals that emphasize the research method. In history, you look at primary and secondary sources that are written in the time or about the time you are studying. For political science and IR, you are oftentimes looking at an issue or a conflict through the lens of a theory or two. Therefore, you are not only looking for sources that help describe the issue or conflict, you are also looking for sources that describe the theories you will use to examine the content of your paper. If you ever end up at a roadblock, you could use the bibliography of a source as a resource for research and finding other materials. After you have found your discipline's appropriate sources, then you move on to analyzing them. Analysis allows a writer to show a reader why a piece of evidence, such as a quote, is important and how it supports a thesis. Within the social sciences, when analyzing, aim to interpret sources by asking yourself the following question: what evidence provided here is most helpful in supporting my argument? When you later begin to write your paper, you will use the evidence found while analyzing your sources to prove your argument and overall thesis. When it comes to theoretical analysis, a writer should state why they are using that theory. This explanation adds to the examination of a theory that is needed. In general, you could analyze a theory or methodology by looking at the weaknesses and strengths of them. You could also question the theory's origin, usefulness, meaning, and logic. Now, here are a few extra steps you could take for analysis in the social sciences. First, determine the type of source you are analyzing. In history, identify whether you are analyzing a primary or secondary source is critical. A primary source is an original document or artifact from a certain time period. For example, a diary entry can be considered a primary source. A secondary source is a document that analyzes, interprets, or evaluates a primary source. When it comes to IR in political science, determining the type of sources you use for analysis depends on the approach or framework or theory you decide to use in your paper. You can approach a paper from different angles. For example, a realism or liberalism perspective can change the trajectory of your paper. You just need to be explicit in emphasizing your thesis statement, how you will prove it, and the conclusions that can be made from your sources alongside that perspective or theory. Another key to sources in political science and IR is to be aware of who published the source and the platform they support. Understanding where a source falls on the political spectrum can provide more insight into how to analyze the information and whether you should even use that source if too biased. As for sociology and psychology, you are analyzing concrete data, statistics, and experiments that have been completed in the past. Most of the data should be geared towards another person's experiment unless you conducted one of your own. The content you pull from these pieces of evidence should explain if a theory or experiment has been proven to be effective. There is no definitive yes or no answer, but you could still be assertive in your research. Show that you have a deep understanding of the effectiveness of a theory through research and argument. After reading and analyzing a source, you could select a few quotes to integrate into your paper. When you integrate a quote, start with an introductory sentence such as, "In Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South," Deborah Gray White investigates how the representation of Black women during slavery have caused stereotypes to form. This sentence helps the reader understand where you are going to pull a quote from. Then you could include an explanatory phrase that describes what the author is saying. For example, an explanatory phrase may sound like, "According to Gray, this is an early articulation of the idea that Black women are uniquely strong." Furthermore, try to use short quotations. A general rule to consider: for every one line of a quote, there should be 2 lines of analysis. Students either don't have enough sources to support their argument or have too many sources and little room to share original thought and opinion. Essentially, make sure you have a balance between quotes and your own ideas. After you have analyzed your sources and integrated your quotes, you will need to answer the "so what" question. In short, the "so what" question asks you, the writer, to consider how your topic adds to a broader conversation. It encourages you to explore the importance of your topic in another context. In particular, for sociology and psychology, the "so what" question is answered in a way that explores how research studies, theories, or methodologies are relevant to current research, looking at the implications of the work and how it could be beneficial or useful to enhance current or future research. In political science, IR, and history, the "so what" question is addressed by adding how your argument agrees or disagrees with the rest of the field and why that statement matters. This helps to add to the conversation already related to your topic. All of these approaches can help with the analysis of a source in the social sciences. Sometimes you can't address all of these tactics if they don't exactly apply to your source. Therefore, be selective and use this as a roadmap to guide you in the right direction, and always make sure to reach out to your professor for help.
Hi friends, it's Amaris Sawyer from the CWS Workshop Committee, and today I'm going to be talking to you about analysis in philosophy. As with any effective essay, the thesis statement is the driving force of the analysis component of a philosophy essay. At Agnes, professors will typically ask that you defend or refute an already established philosophical argument. Your thesis statement should include your personal stance on the philosophical argument in question, while your analysis will consist of both an evaluation of the argument along with evidence reasoning for your stance. In the words of Professor Hall Thorsrud, philosophy should be thought of as a long conversation. In analyzing any argument in philosophy, you have the responsibility to defend the argument, raise objections to the argument, and take a stance on the argument through evaluating its validity. This is, in fact, the long conversation. Before defending or refuting against any philosopher, it is crucial to completely understand the argument and its premises. With the value of understanding in consideration, it is a good idea to outline the argument in question in the introduction paragraph of your philosophy essay. This means laying out the argument's premises and conclusion. In the body paragraphs where you have to defend the argument, you should reconstruct the argument in a way that you show exactly how the premises prove the conclusion. You are telling the reader why the argument is valid by explaining why the premises of the argument are true and serve as an ultimate reflection of the conclusion. Avoid simply listing the premises of the argument. Instead, you should break them down and walk the reader through the same process you went through to determine the validity of the argument in question. While you will be expected to discuss the validity of the argument in the world of the specified text in a 200-level course at Agnes, professors will expect you to provide extended research when defending your argument in question in a 300-level course. Step 2, you must raise objections to the argument. A well-developed analysis in philosophy does not only work to defend the argument in question, but also evaluates the possible objections to it as well. In this section of your philosophical analysis, you are again reconstructing the premises, but instead to show in what ways these premises do not support the conclusion. This is where you discuss the gaps in the argument and the inconsistencies that the conclusion places on the premises. For example, you may be defending the realist argument that universals are real in your essay. An objection to this argument would be the nominalist argument that universals don't have any explanatory value and therefore are not real. In this instance, you would not only discuss why the nominalist perspective is incorrect or ill-informed, but you should also discuss the validity of the perspective and how it succeeds in defeating the realist perspective that you support. In philosophy, this concept is known as the principle of charity, in which one acknowledges the validity of an argument while also pointing out its flaws. Following a principle of charity in your philosophy essay provides you with authority as a writer, since it shows that you have considered both sides of an argument in question. The last responsibility that you have in your philosophical analysis is to support your own position on the argument. What is your personal stance on the argument in question? Do you think it to be true or false? By taking a stance, this is where you introduce your own voice into the long philosophical conversation. One way to further clarify your stance on another philosopher's position is to discuss the validity of the objections that you raised in the previous section of your analysis. Consider whether or not those objections succeed or not in defending your thesis statement. This is a further extension of the principle of charity that forces the philosopher to do a thorough evaluation of the argument in question. Here are a few things to remember in your philosophical analysis. As mentioned, understanding the argument in question is crucial. A lack of full understanding can contribute to both a confused writer and a confused reader. Be sure to outline the premises and conclusion in your introduction paragraph to avoid unintentional misinterpretations of your stance. It will also be important to be clear and succinct in your analysis. You can avoid unnecessary clutter in your philosophy essays by sticking to the key components of the argument, which are the premises and its conclusion. Keep in mind that when defending your stance, you should avoid quoting large chunks of text. Paraphrasing to integrate textual evidence saves space since philosophy essays tend to be short and concise. Considering these concepts when writing your philosophy essays will put you in a position for success. Thanks again for tuning in.
Hello friends, my name is Drisana, and in this section of the workshop I will be discussing analysis in the English discipline. English is unique in the sense that it is broad enough to use various kinds of analyses within the discipline. Therefore, let's quickly overview some of the common types of analysis papers you might encounter. A rhetorical analysis examines how a text persuades its point of view. A theoretical analysis involves analyzing text through theoretical lenses. A comparative analysis uses two of the same elements, genres, text, authors, etc., and analyzes the similarities and differences between the two. A literary analysis examines the literary devices, allusion, diction, foreshadowing, etc., in a text and analyzes how it contributes to the text as a whole. Though there are other types of analyses, these are a few of the most popular. For the rest of the section, I will address common analysis questions and answer them specifically for English assignments. Question 1. Does the professor have a requirement about the number or types of sources? Because there are different types of analyses, there will be different amount of source requirements for each. However, generally speaking, your most important source is the one you are reading or reviewing in class. If you are analyzing a specific book, the book is your starting point and where you will pull a lot of your context and preliminary analysis from. If you are analyzing a specific author, you will pay close attention to their written works. Some assignments will require outside sources in order to support or add to what you have already begun looking at in class. In these cases, it is important to check with your professor about their own personal source requirements. Question 2. How are students in your discipline building off and defending their thesis, or so what? In the English department, students are encouraged to write what they want to write about, as it is much easier to defend a thesis you feel strongly for. Therefore, taking the time to develop your own stance is incredibly important first step when defending your thesis. Generally, you want to go small with your thesis, as having a huge argument can make your analysis long-winded. After you feel confident in your thesis, you want to engage with the author of the primary text. This is a key element when developing your analysis, because simply agreeing or disagreeing with the text or portion of the text is not sufficient. Act as if you were having a conversation with the author. What were they lacking, or what did they do well? What would you tell them to convince them of your argument or stance? This will help build and defend your thesis. Question 3. What types of sources and what kind of content do students need to find? This could tailor their reading. The source section is dependent on the type of analysis you are completing. As mentioned earlier, usually the main source you will use is a source you are already working with in class. However, when you are required to bring in outside sources, it is hugely important to use reputable and credible sources. Question 4. When students get a hold of the text, what are they looking for to help defend their thesis? What is happening in the text? Similar to the last question, what you are looking for depends on the type of analysis you are conducting. However, a rule of thumb when searching through a text is to first notice what you notice. If your thesis is specific and something you are passionate about, you will pick up on connections within the sources. You then want to identify what you are noticing. This step will look different depending on the type of analysis you are conducting. For example, in a literary analysis, you should be identifying literary devices used by the author. The next step is to explain how it works. Continuing with the example of literary devices, here you would explain how the literary device is able to evoke an effect in the reading or on you as the reader. The next step is to describe how it matters and how what you notice is relevant to your thesis. Question 5. After you have read the text, what direct quotations and excerpts should your students include in their written work? You want to include the quotations that you could not reword yourself. If it can be said in your own words, then use your own words. You want to look for the quotations that are so impactful that its phrasing is the best it can be. You also want to manage a balance between the amount of quotes you use in your own writing. As the writer, your words should be taking up most of the space in your analysis in order to maintain your authority. Question 6. How do they incorporate these quotations and excerpts in their body paragraphs? How do they effectively use quotations or excerpts to build their thesis? With English analyses, you want to definitely use quotations to strengthen your thesis. It is likely that whatever you quote or excerpt you are including needs a decent amount of explanation for readers to be able to fully grasp the significance in the text. Giving a brief introduction to the quote before you use it will help guide your reader to understanding your choice and including it. Once you have given the introduction to the quote and presented the quote itself, you want to lead the reader away from the quote and into your analysis. It is easy to assume that the quote speaks for itself, but you never want to leave space for the reader to make assumptions. Therefore, being explicit in your analysis will help guide your reader to understanding your own interpretation.
Thank you so much for tuning into our second workshop in the Essential Elements for Writing series. Be sure to check out our third and final workshop in the series entitled Writing, Abstracts, and Literature Reviews. For more information about the Center for Writing and Speaking at Agnes Scott College and our other programs, check out the rest of our YouTube channel and our official website at agnescott.edu/writing and speaking. Bye-bye.